Human refused the alien girl's heat-driven plea. Moments later her elders asked for his surrender. Hello everyone, before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Now, let's get back to our main character. Ethan Wells had always considered himself a man of logic, a man who trusted science over superstition, evidence over emotion. As a leading expert in intergalactic research, he spent his days studying the mysteries of the universe, meticulously analyzing data, and testing theories. The idea of an alien species reaching out for help seemed like just another anomaly to analyze, not something to act upon. That was, until the day alien Zorath arrived. Ethan had been working late, as usual, when the system alerts flashed across his monitor. The message was simple, yet startling: request for emergency assistance, alien life form enclosed. He wasn't sure what to make of it at first. It was one thing to encounter alien signals or ships, it was another thing entirely for a sentient being to ask for help, unprompted. But curiosity got the best of him. As the ship docked at the research station, Ethan went to meet the visitor. He was taken aback by what he saw. Aylin was unlike anything he had imagined. Her violet skin glowed faintly under the artificial lighting, and her large, glowing eyes seemed to pierce right through him. The air around her felt unnaturally warm, as if her presence altered the very temperature of the room. She was tall, with a grace that reminded him of the legends of Earth's most ancient queens, but the heat radiating from her body left Ethan uncomfortable, unsure of how to act. Aylin's voice broke the silence. "I need your help," she said, her tone urgent but measured. "My people, they are in danger. The heat from our sun is becoming too intense for us to survive. Our planet's core is unstable, and if we don't act soon, it will be too late. You have the technology to help us." Ethan's mind raced. His instincts screamed to question her story, to demand proof. But her eyes, those eyes, held a sincerity that shook him. Still, he couldn't trust her entirely. "Why come to me?" Ethan asked, crossing his arms. "You must have others who can help. Why involve Earth?" Aylin's expression faltered, her hand twitching as if she wanted to reach out but thought better of it. "We have no one left. Your world is the only one that can help us now." She stepped closer, the warmth growing more intense. Ethan could feel the heat beginning to press against his skin. It wasn't painful, but it was undeniable. "Please," Aylin continued, her voice barely above a whisper, "I'm begging you. My people are dying. We need your help." Ethan stepped back, his skepticism rising. He could feel the tension in the air, the pressure building from both her plea and the unusual heat she emanated. The scientist in him wanted to run tests, to probe the truth of her words, but something about her plea struck a chord in him. Still, his better judgment took over. He shook his head. "I can't help you," he said, his voice firm. "Not without evidence. Not without data. You'll need to provide something concrete for me to act." The words hung in the air, thick with the weight of his decision. Aylin's face fell, her shoulders slumping as if she had been struck. The heat in the room surged briefly, before she turned and left, her footsteps echoing down the hallway. Ethan remained standing, watching the door close behind her. He felt uneasy, unsure of whether he had made the right choice. Little did he know, the consequences of that decision would soon unfold in ways he couldn't have predicted. Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The words Aylin had spoken lingered in his mind, turning over and over in his thoughts. "We have no one left. Your world is the only one that can help us now." He paced back and forth in his small office aboard the research station, the walls closing in around him. He was a man of logic, a man who depended on proof, on data. But there was something in Aylin's eyes, something raw and desperate, that made him question his own beliefs. He had made his decision to deny her help, but now, with the hours passing in silence, doubt crept in like a shadow. It wasn't just the plea that bothered him. It was the way she had left, the way the heat in the room had seemed to follow her, like a piece of herself, leaving an unsettling warmth in its wake. Could her story really be true? Was there a deeper meaning behind the strange energy she emitted? Ethan couldn't focus. His hands trembled slightly as he reached for his coffee, but the cup felt too hot in his hands. He set it down quickly, cursing under his breath. He couldn't just dismiss her like that. Not when something in him stirred, something that went beyond science. He wasn't a man of superstition, but this felt different. After a moment of contemplation, Ethan knew what he had to do. He couldn't just sit there and wait for the consequences of his decision to unfold. He needed to know the truth, even if it meant risking everything. Without another thought, he grabbed his coat and made his way to the docking bay. The station's hallways were quiet, almost eerily so. Ethan's footsteps echoed in the empty corridors, his mind racing with thoughts of what lay ahead. What if Felyn was telling the truth? What if her people really were in danger? As he reached the docking bay, he was greeted by a familiar sight, the ship Felyn had arrived in, its sleek design still hovering slightly above the ground, as if it had never truly touched the station. The entrance hatch opened automatically as he approached, and the soft hum of the ship's systems greeted him. Ethan stepped inside, his heart pounding in his chest. The interior was dimly lit, the air thick with an unfamiliar scent. He walked down the narrow corridor, each step more hesitant than the last. Then, he found her. Felyn was standing in the central chamber of the ship, her back to him, staring out at the vastness of space through a large, circular window. The glow of her skin illuminated the dark room, casting an ethereal light across the walls. Ethan cleared his throat, but she didn't turn. "Felyn," he said, his voice softer than he intended. I've been thinking about what you said." She finally turned to face him, her eyes meeting his with that same intensity as before. "And," she asked, her voice filled with a quiet urgency. "I've changed my mind," Ethan admitted, stepping forward. "I want to help you. I want to understand what's really happening." Felyn didn't speak at first. Instead, she studied him with an expression he couldn't read. Her lips parted slightly as if she were about to say something, but the words never came. The tension in the air thickened, and for a moment, it seemed like the room itself was holding its breath. Finally, Felyn spoke, her voice barely a whisper. "Thank you," she said, the sincerity in her words so overwhelming that it caught Ethan off guard. But even as she spoke, the temperature in the room began to rise again, just slightly, as if her emotions were spilling out into the environment around them. Ethan noticed it but didn't comment. He had already made his decision, and now, there was no turning back. Ethan and Felyn worked through the night, the hum of the ship's systems the only sound between them as they went over every detail of the situation. The warmth in the room seemed to grow more intense with each passing hour, but Ethan didn't mind. His mind was occupied, and he could focus on nothing but the task at hand. Felyn had shown him data, images, and calculations that were beyond anything he had ever seen. Her planet, Zorath, was experiencing a catastrophic collapse of its core, an event that threatened to tear the planet apart. They needed technology far beyond what Earth could offer to stabilize the core, or the entire civilization would cease to exist. As Ethan processed the information, his skepticism began to fade. The evidence was too overwhelming to ignore. He could see the truth in Felyn's eyes, in her every word. But there was still a lingering question at the back of his mind. "How did you end up on Earth?" Ethan asked, breaking the silence. Felyn looked at him for a long moment before answering. "My people have been searching for a solution for years. We've sent out messages to every nearby civilization, hoping for a response. Your world was our last hope. I found a way to get here. It wasn't easy. I had to leave everything behind." Her voice faltered for a moment, and Ethan could sense the weight of her words. She wasn't just a diplomat or a scientist, she was someone who had sacrificed everything for the survival of her people. The thought of that made Ethan feel a deep sense of responsibility. "We're not equipped to handle this," Ethan said, still hesitant. "We don't have the technology, the resources, or the knowledge. You're asking me to risk everything on something that might not even work." Felyn's gaze softened, and she took a step closer to him. The heat in the room intensified once more, but Ethan hardly noticed. She didn't say anything at first. Instead, she placed her hand on the console, the light from her skin illuminating the data they were looking at. "I understand your doubts," she said quietly. "I wouldn't ask this of you if I didn't believe it was the only way. My people have nowhere else to turn. If we don't do this, we die. All of us. Her words were heavy, laden with the reality of the situation. There was no going back from this point. Ethan stared at the data in front of him, weighing the consequences of his next move. This was no longer just about science, it was about survival, about the survival of an entire species. His rational mind told him to walk away, to let the alien race figure out their own fate. But his heart, his sense of duty, wouldn't let him. Okay, he said, his voice steady but filled with uncertainty. We'll try. But you have to promise me something, Felyn. She looked at him, her expression unreadable. What? Promise me that we'll do this together. We can't do it alone. You're not alone in this. A slight smile appeared on Felyn's face, and for the first time, Ethan saw something softer in her eyes. I promise, she said. As the warmth in the room began to settle, Ethan knew that this was just the beginning of something much bigger. The fate of two worlds now rested in their hands. Ethan and Felyn stood together in the ship's control room, the soft hum of the system surrounding them. The data they had collected in the last few hours was staggering, unbelievable, even, but it was undeniable. The temperature fluctuations, the instability in the core, the accelerating decay of Zorath's environment, all of it pointed to a grim reality. This wasn't just a natural disaster, it was a ticking clock, and every second counted. Ethan sat at the console, staring at the complex calculations. On the screen. The solution wasn't going to be easy. It was going to require all of his knowledge, his expertise, and, most of all, his trust in Felyn. She had made it clear that Earth's technology alone wasn't enough to save her people. Their civilization was centuries ahead of Earth's in many ways, but the planetary disaster they were facing was beyond even their capabilities. The only way to stabilize the core was to combine their technology with the advanced energy systems that Felyn's people had developed over centuries. It was a delicate process, one that required perfect synchronization, precise calculations, and a deep understanding of both worlds' scientific principles. Are you sure about this? Ethan asked, his voice filled with doubt. If we make even one mistake, it could make things worse. We'll be putting both of our worlds in danger. Felyn nodded, her violet eyes reflecting the gravity of the situation. I know. But there's no other choice. If we don't act now, Zorath will be destroyed, and Earth will be next. The energy imbalance will spread, causing ripple effects throughout the galaxy. Ethan paused, his fingers hovering over the console. He could feel the weight of the decision bearing down on him. It wasn't just about saving Felyn's people, it was about saving humanity, too. But how could he trust the technology of a species he had only just met? How could he put everything he knew at risk? You have to understand, Felyn continued, her voice calm but urgent. My people have spent years developing the system we need. We've traveled across galaxies to find the right technology, and now, we're asking you for help. This isn't just a desperate plea, it's the only way to prevent a universal catastrophe. Ethan turned back to the console, his mind racing. He wasn't just a scientist. He was a man who understood the cost of failure. But he also understood the cost of doing nothing. And so, he made his choice. All right, he said, his voice steady. We'll do this. But we need to move quickly. I'll need access to all your systems, Felyn. Every bit of data you have. Felyn smiled, the faintest glimmer of relief in her eyes. Thank you, Ethan. I knew I could count on you. She stepped forward, her hand hovering near the console, ready to initiate the first phase of the operation. The warmth in the room intensified again, but this time, it felt different. It was no longer just the heat from her, but a shared energy, an energy that came from a common purpose. Together, they worked, their hands moving in sync, inputting commands, adjusting settings, and monitoring data. The ship's systems hummed in response, as if it recognized the importance of what was happening. Ethan felt the pulse of the ship beneath his fingertips, the energy building in the room, matching the rhythm of his heart. As the countdown began, a sense of urgency filled the air. There was no turning back now. The next few minutes would determine the fate of both Zorath and Earth. Ethan could feel the weight of the universe pressing down on him, but he didn't flinch. He had made a promise, and he was going to keep it. With a final command, they initiated the stabilization process. The room grew even warmer, the energy swirling around them, but Ethan stayed focused. This was it. There was no more time for doubt. Only action. Ethan's heart pounded in his chest as the countdown continued. The room was filled with a low, steady hum, the ship's systems working tirelessly to stabilize the energy flows between Earth's technology and Zorath's advanced systems. The air was thick with anticipation, the warmth in the room reaching a near unbearable level as the energy they were channeling began to rise. Ethan could feel the heat seeping into his skin, but he didn't flinch. He knew this was the moment of truth. Aylin stood beside him, her violet eyes locked on the readings, her hand still resting on the console. The two of them had spent hours working together, their minds melding as they adjusted settings, recalibrated frequencies, and monitored every fluctuation. They were in sync, moving as one to prevent a disaster that neither of them could afford to fail. The data on the screen was constantly changing, numbers racing faster than Ethan could process. He had been trained for moments like this, but the scale of what they were attempting was beyond anything he had ever imagined. Every decision, every move could mean the difference between success and utter destruction. "We're almost there," Aylin said, her voice calm but strained. Ethan nodded, his eyes still glued to the screen. The stabilization process was working, but there was a small margin of error. They had to adjust the power levels just right, or else the entire system would overload. Aylin's fingers danced over the controls, making rapid adjustments with a precision that took Ethan's breath away. She was unlike anyone he had ever met, her intellect, her skill, and her determination were extraordinary. As they worked, Ethan could feel the connection between them growing stronger. It wasn't just the shared urgency of the moment, it was something deeper. Aylin was no longer just an alien from a faraway world. She had become someone he could trust, someone whose future was now intertwined with his own. The warmth in the room continued to rise, but Ethan barely noticed it anymore. He had grown used to the energy coursing around them. As long as it meant saving both of their worlds, he would endure. "I think we're there," Aylin said, her voice low but filled with hope. The readings on the screen were finally stabilizing, the fluctuations now within the safe range. The core of Zorath was still unstable, but it was no longer in immediate danger of collapsing. Ethan let out a breath he didn't know he had been holding. The first phase was complete. But they both knew it wasn't over. There was still a long way to go, and the real test was yet to come. Aylin turned to him, her expression a mix of exhaustion and relief. "We've done it," she said softly. Ethan nodded, a small smile tugging at the corner of his lips. "For now," he said. "But this is just the beginning. We still have to find a permanent solution." Aylin's eyes shone with a mix of gratitude and determination. "We will. Together." The room was quiet now, the tension finally easing. The energy that had filled the space was beginning to settle, the warmth slowly dissipating. Ethan stood back for a moment, taking in the sight of Aylin standing beside him. They had saved her world, at least for now. But the work wasn't finished. There was still so much to do, so much they didn't yet understand. As Ethan looked at Aylin, he knew that this was only the beginning of their journey. A journey that would take them to places they couldn't even begin to imagine. Ethan stood at the control panel, staring at the data that filled the screen. The energy readings from Zorath's core were stable for the first time in days. Aylin had done it, together, they had prevented the collapse of her planet. But even as the numbers showed success, the weight of the next step pressed heavily on Ethan's mind. The stabilization was only temporary. It was a band-aid, not a permanent fix. And while they had managed to buy Zorath some time, the real challenge was just beginning. "We need to figure out how to fix the core permanently," Ethan said, his voice low and focused. Aylin nodded, her eyes reflecting the same determination. "I know. The technology we've shared today will only last for so long. If we don't find a sustainable solution soon, the core will destabilize again." She paused for a moment, her gaze turning toward the distant stars outside the ship's window. "We've been searching for answers for years, but nothing has worked. This is our last chance." Ethan felt a surge of resolve. He knew the risks, he had always been a scientist, a man who weighed evidence and calculated probabilities. But this wasn't just about numbers anymore. This was about survival. And it was no longer just about saving Zorath. "We'll find it," Ethan said, turning to Aylin. I don't know how, but we will. The sincerity in his voice surprised him. He wasn't one to make promises easily, but something about Aelin's unwavering commitment to her people stirred something deep inside him. They had made it this far together. It seemed impossible that they wouldn't succeed. Aelin smiled, the warmth of the gesture softening her otherwise intense expression. Thank you, Ethan. I couldn't ask for a better ally. Ethan didn't respond right away. He turned back to the console, tapping a few keys to pull up the data they had collected. The readings were promising, but there were still gaps in their understanding. He needed more information, more time. But time was something they didn't have. Let's run a full analysis, Ethan said, shifting into problem-solving mode. If we can't fix the core, we'll at least know why it failed in the first place. Maybe that's the key to finding a permanent solution. Aelin nodded in agreement. We'll need access to all the data from Zorath's core. It's the only way we'll be able to replicate the conditions here. The two of them worked in silence for a few hours, the only sound the soft tapping of keys and the occasional hum from the ship's systems. The energy between them was palpable, an unspoken bond that had been forged through shared purpose and determination. Ethan couldn't help but notice how, despite their differences, they were united in this goal. There was a feeling of inevitability to it, a sense that they were destined to find a solution together. As the analysis continued, Ethan found himself growing more confident. They were getting closer. He could feel it. But as the hours passed and the data piled up, he also knew that time was running out. The pressure to succeed weighed heavily on him, but he refused to let it break him. He glanced at Aelin, who was focused on her own set of readings. Her dedication was inspiring, and for a moment, Ethan allowed himself to feel a rare sense of hope. Maybe, just maybe, they could do this. The warmth in the room began to subside as the system stabilized further, and for the first time in what felt like an eternity, Ethan allowed himself to relax, even if only for a moment. The journey ahead was still uncertain, but he knew one thing for sure: together, they would find a way forward. Ethan's fingers flew over the control panel, working furiously to integrate the last of the data from Zorath's core into their calculations. The ship was silent except for the occasional beep of the systems, confirming each adjustment they made. Aelin stood beside him, her eyes constantly scanning the readouts, offering suggestions when needed, but for the most part, they were working in perfect harmony. Despite the urgency of the situation, a quiet sense of camaraderie had settled between them. It wasn't just the shared purpose, it was the unspoken understanding that they were both in this together. They had crossed a line. There was no going back now. The only way out was forward. I think we're close, Ethan said, breaking the silence. He adjusted a few more settings, double-checking their parameters. The readings were finally starting to stabilize. The unstable fluctuations in the core had decreased significantly, but they were still too high. We just need to isolate the exact energy signatures from the core to prevent further destabilization. Aelin nodded, but her gaze remained fixed on the data. We can't afford another mistake. If we don't find the right solution, soon, we'll lose everything. Her voice was steady, but there was a slight tremor in it, betraying the weight of what was at stake. Ethan glanced at her. She had been calm throughout the entire process, but he knew how much the pressure was building on her. She had more at stake than anyone, her people, her entire world. We're not losing anything, Ethan said, his voice reassuring but firm. Not on my watch. Aelin looked at him, her violet eyes locking onto his with an intensity that caught him off guard. I know, she said quietly. But sometimes, things are beyond our control. We just have to keep fighting. Ethan felt a weight settle on his chest. He had spent his life in control of everything around him, his research, his career, his destiny. But this was different. There were too many variables, too many unknowns. But despite the uncertainty, he found himself believing in her words. They couldn't stop now. Let's finish this, he said, and together, they dove back into the data, working in unison. The room had grown warmer again, the familiar heat from Aelin radiating through the space, but it was no longer oppressive. It was a reminder of the bond that had formed between them. The hours passed in a blur, and soon, they had gathered enough information to initiate the final phase of the operation. Ethan hesitated for a moment, his finger hovering over the last command. This was the point of no return. If they were wrong, the consequences could be catastrophic. But if they were right, they could save Zorath and Earth. Are you ready? Aelin asked, her voice steady but full of determination. Ethan nodded, a quiet resolve settling over him. I am. He pressed the button. The system hummed, and the ship seemed to vibrate with the intensity of the operation. The energy from Zorath's core began to shift, its unstable fluctuations now under control. The readings on the screen steadied, and the glow from the console softened. It was working. They had done it. For the first time since this journey began, Ethan felt a wave of relief wash over him. He turned to Aelin, who was standing silently beside him, her eyes reflecting the success of their efforts. We did it, he said, his voice quiet with awe. Aelin smiled, her expression softer than it had been since they first met. Yes, she said, her voice full of emotion. We did. They stood together, watching the final stages of the stabilization process unfold on the screen. There was still a long road ahead, but for the first time, they had hope. Together, they had saved her world. And for the first time in a long while, Ethan felt like the future wasn't as uncertain as it had seemed. There was still so much to learn, so much to do, but they had taken the first step. And that, Ethan realized, was more than enough. Ethan watched the data scroll across the screen, his heart still pounding from the intensity of the last few hours. The stabilization was holding, the numbers steady, and for the first time in what felt like forever, Zorath's core was no longer in immediate danger. A sigh of relief escaped his lips, though he knew better than to celebrate prematurely. This was only the beginning, and they still had a long way to go. He turned to Aelin, who stood quietly beside him, her eyes fixed on the same screen. Her face, usually calm and composed, now carried an expression of deep exhaustion, but there was a flicker of hope in her gaze. She had been the driving force behind this effort, the one who had never given up, even when the odds were stacked against her. Ethan felt a sense of admiration for her that went beyond the professional. She wasn't just a scientist or a diplomat, she was someone who had fought for her people, who had carried the weight of an entire world on her shoulders. It's working, Ethan said softly, more to himself than to Aelin. She nodded but didn't speak at first, as though taking a moment to absorb the significance of their success. Yes, she said, her voice quiet but steady. But it's only the first step. We've bought time, but we need to keep going. Ethan knew she was right. The core was stable for now, but the energy they had stabilized was still volatile. They needed a long-term solution, one that would prevent future instability and allow Zorath to thrive once more. What happens next? He asked, turning back to the console to review the next phase of their plan. Aelin crossed the room to a nearby terminal, pulling up additional data. We need to access the main energy conduits and stabilize the reactor. That will allow us to control the flow of energy from the core and keep it balanced. Ethan nodded, following her instructions. And how long will that take? A few more hours, Aelin said, her fingers flying over the keyboard as she entered the necessary commands. If everything goes according to plan, we should be able to secure the core permanently. But it will require precision, and we can't afford any errors. Ethan understood. They had come too far to let anything go wrong now. Let's get started, he said, the words leaving his mouth with a sense of determination. The two of them worked together, focusing on the task at hand. Time seemed to stretch and blur as they input commands, recalibrated the ship's systems, and adjusted energy levels. The warmth in the room grew, but it was a familiar presence now, almost comforting. As they worked, Ethan couldn't help but notice the subtle connection between them. It wasn't just the shared mission that bound them, it was something deeper, something unspoken but undeniable. Aelin had opened up to him in a way that no one ever had, and he had come to understand her in ways that went beyond intellect. There was an unspoken trust between them now, a bond forged in the fires of this mission. It was the kind of connection that changed a person, made them see the world differently. Hours passed, the ship's hum continuing to provide a steady background to their efforts. The final phase of the operation was approaching, and Ethan knew that every move they made was critical. They were almost there. The core was stabilizing, and the reactor was beginning to align with the new energy flow. Aelin's voice broke the silence, her words steady but filled with a quiet sense of urgency. We're ready, she said. We have to initiate the final sequence now. Ethan glanced at her, meeting her gaze. This was it. The moment they had worked so hard for. "Let's do it," he said, his voice filled with the same quiet resolve that had carried them through the last few hours. Together, they pressed the final command. The energy in the room intensified for a brief moment, a pulse that vibrated through the ship, and then, stillness. The systems were quiet, the numbers on the screen steady. The core was stable. It was done. Ethan leaned back in his chair, a sense of exhaustion flooding through him. They had done it. Against all odds, they had succeeded. Zorath's core was stable, and with it, the future of her people. Aelin turned to him, her expression softening as she saw the look on his face. "Thank you, Ethan," she said, her voice full of emotion. "We couldn't have done this without you." Ethan nodded, the weight of their success settling in. "We did it together," he said quietly. Together, they had saved a world. And together, they would face whatever came next. Ethan and Aelin stood in the quiet of the control room, the soft hum of the ship's systems the only sound between them. The data on the screens had finally stabilized, and for the first time in days, they were no longer racing against the clock. The core of Zorath was secure, its energy levels within acceptable limits. The task that had seemed insurmountable only hours ago was now complete. Ethan took a deep breath, letting the weight of the moment settle over him. It had been a long journey, one that had taken him far beyond the comfortable world of logic and science he had always known. He had risked everything, his career, his reputation, and even his own life, to help Aelin and her people. And in the end, it had worked. They had done the impossible. Aelin was standing by his side, her eyes focused on the screens, but he could sense the exhaustion in her, too. Her shoulders were slightly slumped, and the tension that had once radiated from her was beginning to fade. But there was something else in her gaze, something that had been there from the very beginning, a quiet gratitude that spoke volumes. "We did it," Ethan said, his voice filled with quiet satisfaction. Aelin turned to him, her expression softening. "Yes, we did," she replied, her voice filled with emotion. "And I will never be able to thank you enough." Ethan looked at her, a faint smile tugging at his lips. "You don't need to thank me. We did this together." A silence stretched between them, not uncomfortable, but full of understanding. They had fought side by side, against a force far greater than either of them alone. And now, they had saved an entire world. Aelin stepped away from the console and walked to the large window that overlooked the stars. For a moment, she simply stood there, staring out into the vast emptiness of space. Ethan joined her, looking out at the swirling nebulae and distant stars. He had always believed that space was infinite, full of endless possibilities. But now, it felt different. Now, he knew the true cost of that infinity. "What happens now?" Ethan asked, his voice low as he watched her. Aelin turned to face him, her eyes steady. "We rebuild," she said simply. "We find a way to live, to thrive, and to honor those we've lost." She paused, a slight sadness creeping into her expression. "Zorath is not the same as it once was. But we will make it better. We will adapt." Ethan nodded, his gaze lingering on her face. There was a quiet strength in her, something that had carried her through this entire ordeal. "And Earth?" Aelin smiled faintly. "Earth will be fine. We've learned a lot from each other. Maybe it's time to share that knowledge, to help each other more." Ethan turned back to the window, his thoughts swirling. They had come so far, and yet, there was so much more to learn. They had saved a planet, but the future was still uncertain. He glanced over at Aelin, who was watching the stars with a faraway look in her eyes. He realized that, in a way, they were both looking at the same thing. They were no longer just two people from different worlds. They were partners, bound by their shared experiences. And whatever came next, Ethan knew they would face it together. The warmth that had filled the room earlier seemed to settle into a comfortable silence, the kind that only comes after a hard-fought victory. There was still work to be done, but for now, they could rest. They had saved Zorath. And in doing so, they had saved each other.